This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything. I'm Sarah Edmondson.
And I'm Anthony, air quotes nippy, Ames.
And this is A Little Bit Culty, a podcast about what happens when things that seem like a great thing at first go bad.
Every week, we chat with survivors, experts, and whistleblowers for real cult stories told directly by the people who lived through them.
Because we want you to learn a few things we've had to learn the hard way.
Like, if you think you're too smart to get sucked into something culty, you're already prime recruitment material.
You might even already be in a cult.
Oops. You better keep listening to find out.
Welcome to Season 6 of A Little Bit Culty. Welcome back, everybody, to this week's heavy-hitting episode on A Little Bit Culty.
This one is perfect because it's right in line with all my quasi-pseudo, what do you want to call it? Like what I think is going on in the world amongst billionaires. So it's perfect timing. So according to our guest today, the world's biggest hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, and its famed pseudo-philosopher, king founder, Ray Dalio, are operating a cult in plain sight. There I go. I said it.
Rob Copeland is the author of the New York Times bestseller titled The Fund, which tells all and spares nothing in exposing the dark underbelly of a particularly seedy part of Wall Street.
To quote a recent New York Times review, most of The Fund doesn't feel like a book about finance. Instead, it is about how a man of surpassing mediocrity used money to control and humiliate, and how much people abase themselves for it, which, come to think of it, makes it one of the better books ever written about Wall Street.
A mediocre man fails up and then uses the money and power he's accrued to control and humiliate people? Where have we heard that one before?
No clue, sir.
You know who is not mediocre? Rob freaking Copeland. Can we just brag about him for a second?
So check this out. Rob is a seasoned finance reporter for the New York Times and was previously the longtime hedge fund beat reporter at the Wall Street Journal and has also covered Silicon Valley and the hidden world of the wealthy and powerful.
His front-page investigations into Bridgewater Associates won a New York Press Club award. Plus, he was also awarded an honorable mention twice by the Society of American Business Writers, SABEW, and was named a News Media Alliance Rising Star and has appeared on ABC's Good Morning America, NPR, and other major news networks.
Pretty impressive street cred there, Rob. Let's get this A Little Bit Culty party started. Here's our chat with Rob Copeland on his story of the culty world of Bridgewater Associates.
Buckle up. Rob Copeland, welcome finally to A Little Bit Culty.
Thank you for having me.
How are you, Rob?
Very good, very good.
So we've been devouring your book and really had to refrain from texting and emailing every 2 seconds about the bizarre and uncanny similarities between Ray Dalio, Keith Raniere.
It's nuts.
Elizabeth Holmes, Werner Erhard.
But the parallels are staggering. And
Holy
the
cow.
buy-in is the same. Everything's like, we have like detailed files
We have
over
detailed
here.
files.
So I think also too, one of the things to tell Rob, it's like a couple guys like, 5-6 years ago, I think one of them gave me Principles as a gift. I read it. I kind of felt like that's a book that would have meant more to me in my 20s than it does now as an adult, the Principles. But I didn't really have any strong objections to it and really any strong objections to Ray Dalio. When we got your intake sheet, your jot form, I was kind of like, really, Ray Dalio? Well, okay. It wasn't like, I had no idea because he markets himself so well. Like he's gone from a hedge fund manager to a self-marketer and a self-promoter.
Guru, a life principles guru.
And reading this, it makes sense now in hindsight, but because I never looked underneath the hood of Ray Dalio that...
Who has time to, unless you're on this podcast?
Well, unless you're peripheral. So it was interesting to see this persona get exposed.
Yes.
It's funny. I was not super aware of Keith Raniere, and someone who worked at Bridgewater, who was very close to Ray, mentioned it to me offhand. He said, "Have you seen this series, The Vow?" And my first reaction was, oh, come on, this is too on the nose. This guy is like an international criminal. It's like, listen, like just because you don't like your boss doesn't mean that there's so many similarities here. And then I started reading about it. I started watching the series, and I was like, oh my gosh, these two men are doing the same thing. They have some of the same ideas. People
Yep.
are reacting to them in the same way. And so I was very excited too, because I was just like, well, Keith did the whole thing and he didn't even have to pay you that much. And
Right.
so to me, the great fun of Ray and really the darkness of it too is, what if you had this sort of self-enlightenment, everything that I'm doing is to help you, et cetera, philosophy, and you also paid people actually pretty decently. How much further could you get them to go?
God, so many questions. I want to go back to the beginning. Obviously, you're not a survivor in the normal sense, but you've been through this whole rigmarole of a journey with Bridgewater. How did it get on your radar? Tell us your story of this debacle expose.
Sure. So there's really two beginnings for me. One is that I graduated college in 2009, and I had, it was like right at the peak of the financial crisis, and I got a job that I didn't really like, and I applied for pretty much every job in the New York area that was hiring new college grads. And Bridgewater Associates was just one of the many, many firms that had a reputation for hiring young people with no life experience and saying, hey, come move an hour and a half outside the city to the middle of the woods, and we're a big finance firm. So I applied there. I did a few interviews. I didn't get the job. I honestly didn't think anything else of it. I got very few jobs then. So a few years later, I was really committed to journalism, and I was working for a hedge fund trade publication, which is just like a magazine that caters to the hedge fund industry. And Bridgewater, world's biggest hedge fund, was a big part of our coverage. And that's when I started to hear more about it and hear more about what he calls the principles and this sort of like pseudo like self-help philosophy that he's got going on. And he just kept getting more and more famous. So it went from something that I would have heard of because I was looking for a job to something that I would have heard of because I was in finance journalism, to then all of a sudden something that, Nippy is getting a book gifted to him by someone who I imagine
Right.
didn't work at Bridgewater. Ray just became very intentionally this super famous figure and wanted to be about more than just making money.
I think one of the things, hearing that part of it, you mentioned they hire people young right out of college without experience. To me, that's a very important caveat to the whole thing, because in one of your interviews you talk about, I think the phrase you use is, they attracted people who want to give up their belief system and adopt the Bridgewater.
They're malleable.
And, I look at my experience of why I was even interested in, taking a training or something like that. Is like, I think that's kind of, I'm not saying I was looking to replace my belief system per se, but ultimately, you take that behavior out it's loyalty to the party, so to speak. And I think that little piece right there, looking for young people without experience, I think is what allows him to have that culture right away.
Exactly.
I don't know if you came across this. Did you notice that was a majority of the people that were susceptible to it?
So there were two major types of people, for sure, who Ray is able to attract to Bridgewater. The majority, most, are exactly what you're talking about. They are new college graduates. And I'm not sure I would agree necessarily, by the way, that they want to give up their values more than that they can very easily, because they don't necessarily have any. They have, what their parents would have raised them, or their religion, or anything else.
Right.
But they haven't yet developed a good sense of what a workplace is and what limitations to put. So in many cases, they don't even know they're doing it, which is even more powerful. And the other sort of person is, he attracts these people who are sort of on the second half of their career, they're not incompetent, by the way, in any means, but they're not necessarily on the path to, become CEOs of major companies in their own right. And those people, I think, they have a sense of right and wrong, and they are actively putting aside what they know to be right for a chance at making a lot of money. But even more than that, at this being sort of their last chance to achieve this greater goal. I was always struck by how few women, by the way, were in this organization. It was so overwhelmingly young men in 20s, low 20s, frankly. I was once there observing a meeting, and I think I put this in the book, but it literally looks like a J. Crew catalog. It was just like, oh, you're all the same
Yeah.
person. I'm not even sure you're modeling yourself
Yeah.
all the same. So it's so visual to
I mean,
me.
kind of a frat house atmosphere.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
and with the attendant consequences.
Mhm.
Yeah. Including lots of alcohol and adult entertainment. And
Well, a frat house is your first cult, except you graduate from it.
right. Yeah. And we've covered that here on the show. Let me back up for a second. I mean, for somebody like myself who doesn't know much about the stock market and hedge funds, and by the way, I shall never invest after reading this book because it seems just crazy. But anyway, for those people who don't really understand this world, can you give me like an elevator pitch of what Bridgewater said that it was? Like, because we always ask our survivors, like, what did you think you were buying into? What was the world that the people signing up for to work there, what did they think they were engaging in?
Absolutely. And this, by the way, is something that I thought they were engaging in too for a long period of time. I didn't walk into this project and say, oh my gosh, I've got such an expose. So Bridgewater is the world's most famous macroeconomic hedge fund. And what that means is that Ray Dalio, the founder and the firm, claim to be able to predict the direction of any market in the world, essentially. They say, we're going to make you money no matter, give us your money and we will invest it. And we can, bet on stock markets anywhere in the world. We can tell you that the currency of a country is going to appreciate or depreciate. And that because we've studied history and we have this amazing investment system, that we are better at this than anyone else. So give us your money and we will invest it for you. And no matter what happens, in the US stock market or with Bitcoin or with something else, you will, over a long period of time, make money. And they will collect, by the way, a fee based on what they make for you so they can become very wealthy. That's not a crazy pitch, by the way. There are lots of finance firms that say that they can do that. And we could have a whole nother podcast talking about whether, any of them can. But what Bridgewater adds layers on top of that is Ray doesn't just say, oh, I'm really good at this. He says, I'm only good at this because over time, over decade, I have come up with these rules. And these rules are called the principles. And I follow the principles both in my investing life and in my personal life. And you too can follow these rules. And if you do, this is literally what he says, you will achieve a more meaningful life with meaningful relationships. So yes, he's an incredibly successful investor, and that's what he pitches. But part of the reason why he's able to keep this going for so long and why so many people are willing to give him money and to, buy his book and gift it to people is that he says, this isn't just about money. Yes, I'm incredibly good at making money. He's worth, $20 billion. But he's like, it's not about the money. It's about a meaningful life with meaningful relationships. And that, I will tell you, is just a completely intoxicating pitch.
Oh, yeah. It sounds very familiar to us.
Minus the money.
Well, but who doesn't, whether you're interested in Wall Street or not, who doesn't want to live a more meaningful life? Who walks through their life and says, I'm looking for less meaning?
Right.
Okay, so that's the pitch. So you didn't go into this going, I'm going to do this big expose. What was your journey? What were you trying to figure out? And what were the first, I guess, red flags that you started to see that there was problems? Tell us about your journey as a journalist.
Well, as a journalist, this is a wonderful place to write about, right? Because it can get a little boring sometimes just writing about very successful investor makes money or very successful investor loses money. Those are essentially the two main things we write about as finance journalists. But in
right.
in Ray and Bridgewater, you got to write about this whole culture and this whole idea that, oh, there's a firm, a very successful and famous one, which happens to be making money, but is also sort of creating this whole new cohort of a better person and better colleagues. So when I first started writing about it, it was honestly pretty ordinary. I was talking to Ray Dalio myself. I was talking to current and former employees. And the first thing that always felt odd to me was that one of the principles, part of the animating principle, Ray's animating philosophy, is that we should all be willing to disagree with one another. That if we could just cut through the bull if we could just say, hey, this isn't going well, or this is what I think you could be doing better. And if we could remove our ego from it, we can, achieve better results.
Radical transparency, I think is what it's called.
Exactly.
Right?
Radical transparency and truth.
Yeah.
And part of that is that everything at Bridgewater is recorded, so that this conversation, even if it were a private meeting, someone else could pull it up later and listen, and they could say, hey, I think like Sarah was really onto something there, and Rob and Nippy cut her off.
That happens all the time.
It does.
Exactly.
It's a two-way street.
Yeah, there you go.
It's traffic. A lot of traffic on that.
But what struck me was that in all of my conversations with Ray and all of my examples of talking to other people, no one ever gave me any examples of someone saying that to Ray. It was always Ray saying that to other people. One of Ray's famous principles that he loves to talk about is called pain plus reflection equals progress. And again, and I'll say this over and over again, these things always sound good. Like, of course, we've all been through moments in our lives when we've had pain and then we've reflected and they've helped make us stronger people. But I just started collecting examples of Ray being really cruel to people and then claiming that those people had achieved progress. But what he never talked about was that the pain wasn't an exogenous pain. It was pain that Ray was choosing to inflict on you, and that the reflection was sort of forced reflection. So it took me years, literally, probably started in about 2015 when I started reporting around this firm. And you just sort of collect enough anecdotes where you're saying, hold on, is there something else going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard work. It's not just something where I can just pick up the phone and call 5 people and then they spill out their life story,
Especially with the NDAs and the secrecy and the other protective mechanism, which was also, by the way, very much a part of NXIVM, this concept of not speaking behind someone's back, not gossiping, that you only were to speak to somebody if like in the room directly. NXIVM, that was called not speaking with honor. If you were gossiping, that was being dishonorable, which is, again, a good thing, but it protects people from sharing any concerns and then therefore protects the leader from any negative complaint, right? So when did you start to piece together? So you collect these anecdotes about Ray basically allegedly being abusive under the guise of creating a possibility for growth.
You can say alleged. I'm allowed to just say he's being abusive.
Okay.
I'll say he's being abusive.
I just wanted to ask that, like, he's still really rich and powerful. Like, are we in danger by talking about this? Like,
you're not.
You overestimate our podcast.
And not to go super jingoistic here, but the United States of America is like the greatest place to be a journalist. All of my reporting is based on the truth. He's welcome to sue me if you'd like. God knows he's tried several times, but I am telling the truth. It's based on my reporting, and come at me.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm glad that you feel so safe. Are we safe?
I'm not worried. And like I say, if it's the truth, I'll die on that hill.
Ray, if you're listening, I'd love to have you on our podcast to talk about the principles and why they're not culty.
I'd love to hear it, honestly.
I would too.
No, well, I'm sure he'd love to tell it.
Absolutely. I would absolutely.
He would love to tell it in a conversation he curates.
We could talk about our respective TED Talks and,
yeah, Sarah,
we have so much to talk about.
Sarah,
Ray, I'm from Vancouver. He did a TED Talk there at the time we were leaving NXIVM, and there's so many full circle things. That. Anyway.
You brought up a really interesting point, which is this whole don't talk about someone behind their back. At Bridgewater, it's called don't be a slimy weasel. This is literally a principle. If you talk about someone behind their back, you're a slimy weasel. And the wonderful thing, of course, is that it forces you to say terrible things about people, even things that frankly might not be necessary to say to their face. And then they get to argue with you and tell you why you're wrong. And it is an artifice to create argument and tension where, in my opinion,
and conflict.
Yeah, it ensures constant conflict.
Yes.
There's I don't want to spoil, but halfway through the book, someone very important in the book does actually attempt to call Ray a slimy weasel. He does say that, Ray, you're not sticking to your word. And Ray, well, as you can imagine, finds a way to turn it against that person who's done nothing but follow the principles and speak his truth.
That was Mac, right?
That's Jensen. But oh, he does too.
Jensen.
Yeah.
Yes.
There are, look, the wonderful thing about this story for me, and by the way, it's not like I find there'd be like some humor in all of this. It's horrible because it's people's real life, but there's a history repeating endlessly inside Bridgewater. And there's a fun, and frankly, I think there's there's those such horrible things happen to people around NXIVM. Something that I always felt and enjoyed about watching the series and everything was like every time you thought someone was just about to figure it out or break through or speak the truth, Keith or someone else would come up with a new reason to sort of push them down.
Yeah.
And Ray does the exact same thing in, frankly, super creative ways.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I actually wonder, is there any chance they could have met each other? Like, were they were they actually comparing notes, like down to the rating and ranking of each other? You know that we did that in NXIVM, right?
I do. I saw that. That was the sashes blew my mind.
The sashes are part of our rules and rituals. I don't know if you remember the aspect of rules and rituals. That's what the principles are. You come in and you immediately
have to
are
accept.
Forced to do something that shows, I wouldn't say your obedience per se, but eventually your obedience.
No,
it shows your compliance.
If you don't like the rules and rituals, you get kicked out.
Well, you don't get kicked out. You are slowly encouraged to until you kind of go, well, what's the big deal, right? I think that's the first. Some people are all in. Some people are, okay, well, let's see what it is. It's not bad. The principles aren't bad. Like when you read what he said, in theory, if these are rooted and moored and tethered to the real principles that he's talking about, you could have possibly some
the
possibility.
Good and the bad of it.
And then I'd say, or the sashes, in a lot of ways, the rules and rituals are parallel with the principles, and the sashes are your paycheck.
Well, it's also the measurement.
You got rewarded with a sash.
Right? Like the attempt to make something emotional, scientifically measurable that was his whole thing, right? He spent tens of millions of dollars trying to, can you explain what the technology was that he was trying to do? Because you probably can explain it better than I can.
Baseball cards.
Yeah. Can you explain the dotting and the cards and all that?
It's
so
crazy.
What's funny too is I've written a book which is I'm very happy with, and it's called a business book. But there's almost nothing in this book about business or Wall Street. It's about this very successful man's attempt to sort of create a new society off grid and to rank everyone around him. So the principles, which start with 5 or 6 rules and then grow to be hundreds of rules. And by the way, he's still making new ones up literally every day. You could follow him on LinkedIn. I can't follow him. He's blocked me, this paradigm of radical transparency. But I am told. So he creates what he calls the baseball cards, or he has other people do this. And what it is he creates all these categories for the ways that he thinks that people are. So they're in categories such as, ability to push through to find the truth, or listening, or investing. But a lot of them are a little nebulous. And everyone at every point is supposed to be rating each other. So even during this conversation, you would be rating me at, pushing through to the hardness or whatever, and on a 1 to 10 scale. And then all of our ratings are agglomerated, and they're on what is called our baseball card, which is just like an MLB player would say their RBIs, their home runs, whatever. And so that we're able to, at the beginning of a meeting or at any interaction, even in the cafeteria, to say, well, Sarah, you're really good at XYZ according to your baseball card. You're a 6.7. And Rob, you're only a 5.2. So Sarah's opinion counts more. So, it takes truth, which I believe to be binary. Something is true and something cannot be true. And it totally muddies it, because then Sarah's opinion about the truth can count more than mine because she is considered more believable, more credible. Okay. I just took a very complicated thing. I tried to distill it for you, but I'm not spoiling the book for you here, because I actually intentionally put this in the introduction to the book. I make sure I show you at the beginning, which is that this whole rating system is rigged from the very start to make sure that Ray Dalio's ratings are the highest, no matter what, in all the most important categories, which means that if we ever have a disagreement and we ever say, hey, let's be fair about this, let's look at the baseball cards, we will always look at the baseball cards and Ray will always win the argument, whether it's true or not, whether he's right or wrong. And this took me years to figure out, by the way. Years.
How'd you figure it out?
The embarrassing thing is when I spoke to the right people to figure out it actually had been actively rigged and Ray had asked for it to be rigged. I was almost embarrassed for myself, because I was like, oh, of course it's rigged. It's like, how could I ever have not thought of it? Knowing everything else I know, how could it not be rigged? And then the people I were talking to were just like, yeah, I'm the one who rigged it. It was like, oh yeah, I was told by my boss to go in and just make sure that like his rating And then I just tweaked all the other ratings to make sure that no one else could. So I tell you that in the book, by the way. I put it in the intro in a sort of fun scene. And then I never tell you again because I don't want to hit you over the head with it. It's like the great thing about Bridgewater and about a lot of these organizations is even if you know that it's rigged, you can still sort of forget. You can still get caught up in it, right?
Right.
To me, there are so many people who at Bridgewater, former Bridgewater, spouses were at Bridgewater. They say to me, they're just like, I couldn't believe it was rigged. And I was like, how could you believe it was anything else? Did you actually think he had invented a new way of judging human performance from his hedge fund in Westport, Connecticut? And then they feel a little silly.
Oh, yeah. We've had those moments.
I've had years of those moments.
No, how do the baseball cards relate to the dot method?
Sure. So, and this being endlessly complicated, which is the Bridgewater way, each time that I agree with you or disagree with you, each time I want to rate you in these, again, close to 100 categories, I give you a dot. I dot you. And I say, hey, your dot, you had a 6 dot or you had a 4 dot. And then it should, in theory, not average out, but sort of all crunch through the numbers to give you sort of an overarching rating. Now, there are 1,000 fascinating things about this, but what I love most is that you had a minimum number of dots. So I couldn't just go through the day and be a nice guy. You are forced to lean into discomfort. And there is, in fact, a minimum number of negative dots. So I can't go through the day and just say, hey, this was all great. And if you don't give enough negative dots, they will pay you less. So if you actually go through the day, you are forced to find sort of like the things that are wrong, even if there is nothing wrong. And in many cases, people begin inventing things that are wrong, or they begin, it slides down the waterfall sort of, and they start dotting the cafeteria staff. They dot the admins. People start to say you're bad at your job as a secretary because your boss showed up late.
So you're incentivized to be a dick.
Correct, but to them, you are incentivized, and this is a principle, to find badness in everything around you. And the thing that you know most...
Wow.
What a terrible way to live.
I would tend to agree with you. Remember, the thing that you know most is the things that are most close to you, the things that are around you. So it's Ray's way of having everyone investigate everyone around them at any time. Like you can't have a true friend because they are incentivized to find the badness around them.
It kills trust.
This is the definitive example of why it was a toxic relationship, the toxic workplace. I mean, what a terrible place to work.
The foundation to growing anything is you have to have trust.
Yeah, you can't
right?
trust.
And this seems to usurp trust. At least, unless you're with someone like, hey, look, I'll keep my negatives away from you if you keep your negatives away from me. This podcast wouldn't happen without our amazing, supportive, generous patrons. Are you with us? Come find us over on Patreon at patreon.com/alittlebitculty for bonus episodes, exclusive content, and the occasional Zoom with our fan favorites from our past episodes. It's a lot of fun over there, people.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
You've heard from our sponsors. Now let's get back to A Little Bit Culty, shall we? I have 3 things to tell you about NXIVM that I don't think were in the vow. One is that in SOP, we did this exercise. Basically, they were literally, the men and women were divided, and the women had numbers on them, like cattle, and we weren't called by our names, we were called 32 or whatever. Like a man would raise their hand and go, 32 just got distracted with her Stanley water bottle. No, but first would say, sorry, fault on 32, like out loud in real time. Fault on 32. She's not paying attention to the questions. Like calling out in real time our faults. So that just, I don't think we've ever talked about that on the podcast. Secondly, the rating and ranking, obviously with the sashes, but we also did it in one training. This didn't become a thing. This is where I think Ray and Keith were maybe buddies. It was on paper. This would have been 2006. And it was a rating and ranking before we broke out into discussion groups of who was the most intelligent, who was the most attractive, who was the most honest. There's like 5 or 6 categories from most to least in the circle. So we're in a circle of 6. So I'd be like, Nippy, I think you're the least honest. Rob, I think you're the most honest. And then obviously you start to see the repercussions of that in the next round. Like you'd get lower marks because people's feelings were hurt. I noticed if I wore my glasses, I got more intelligent ratings, etc. So I've had this little taste of this from our time in NXIVM, and it was horrific.
But the difference is we could turn that off and go home and have dinner.
I know, this is every day.
This felt like, also like your paycheck was incentivized. So think about that kind of atmosphere, but constantly. And I imagine, if you're out in Connecticut, that's your social circuit as well.
It is. And I would add another layer, by the way, to what you're saying, which is, okay, you go around, you say who is the best or who's the worst or et cetera. What Ray would do often, and others at Bridgewater who are emulating him, is if you said, I think that Nippy is doing a great job today at XYZ, and they disagree, they would look at the baseball card. They would say, Nippy's a 4.2 at this. Sarah, what's wrong with you? They could turn it around on you, Sarah, just for offering a true opinion about it. And then they would do what they call a probe. They could literally start investigating you with cameras rolling for why you think so highly of Nippy. And then it can just, it rolls downhill. Someone tries to stick up for you. All of a sudden, it's an investigation of them. So there's really very little incentive to go against the grain. And the standard is set by the founder, Ray Dalio, whose ratings are bulletproof. So the whole thing is a farce because it looks like we're giving each other feedback, but we're really not. We're just trying to stay out of fire ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Trying to maintain our own ratings. Nippy and I have pages and pages of similarities, but one of the things that I just thought I meant to do this earlier, but looking at the belief system of any particular group, whether, we talk about a religion or whatever the group is, there seems like a adherence to a very specific thing right at the beginning that kind of protects Ray moving forward, specifically that you're there to learn and grow. Therefore, anything that comes out at you is part of that. That's part of the belief system you're buying into. What else do you see people are accepting as the belief system, and where does it become problematic or toxic?
This took me a long time, honestly, to get my head around, because there is a principle that says essentially when you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you put it in cold water and you slowly up the temperature, it will stay in there and die. First of all, that's not true. That's not how science works. In many experiences, you can put a frog in cold water and up it, and it'll jump right out and it won't die. So that's my first great principle is you didn't even get your.
Oh shit! I got to stop using that metaphor.
Right.
Good. We could put that metaphor to rest.
Yeah, exactly.
Too often.
So first of all, there is an element to that. 2, remember, he's telling you when you come in. He literally says, this is going to be difficult. This is like the Navy SEALs. You will go through pain. You will, but it's for your own good. So anything that happens to you can then be justified, pretty much. There are no degrees of pain at Bridgewater. It's simply pain. And if you leave, he calls it getting through to the other side, which is Scientology, by the way. It's straight up lifted from L. Ron Hubbard, whether intentionally or not. So if you don't get through to the other side, you're basically giving up on this promise. But there's a third element to this, which is, I think, the most powerful, which is that he starts to layer pseudoscience on top of it. He starts to say that your brain is composed of the right side and the left side, the amygdala, which is irrational, and the rational side of your brain. And the amygdala fights dirty, literally, something he says. So he says, you have to fight your own instinct. You have to fight the amygdala. It's keeping you back from achieving what you can. So he's literally saying, ignore your own instincts. Ignore your brain. Your brain is against you. And By the way, this is in Principles. This is in his book. This is not something hidden. But if you tell people, particularly, 22, 23-year-olds who are really still developing, that this might feel bad, but you won't amount to anything. My whole success, my $20 billion comes from me having overcome my amygdala. I don't have a counterpoint to that, right? What can I say? Either I've bought in, either I'm there, or I'm not. You don't get to say, I don't know, I don't really like this anymore, because he told you you wouldn't like it. By the way, I speak to college students. People always ask me why people stay. And I'm like, it's not why they stay, it's why they joined to begin with. They wanted something when they joined, and they signed the contract, whether they did it or not.
Yeah, you wrote in our intake form that people ask why people don't leave, and you say the episode of Vow season 2, where it's not just being locked in a room, but about systems that warp your mind that you just don't even try to open the door.
I bring that up constantly because she's in the room, right? And by the way, her whole support system is keeping her there emotionally, if not physically, although there is definitely a physical coercion there too. But it's true. At Bridgewater, you can quit. You can walk out the door, go to your car, and leave. But in doing so, you're giving up all your friends, you're giving up your salary, and you're giving up the promise that you will get through to the other side. So that's why they literally at Bridgewater get sent to the hospital. Ambulances come, people have collapsed, and then people come back to work. Yeah, it's wild.
I'm going to send you a copy of my book. There's a chapter that Keith actually called it, "We have to create the illusion of hope." He told me that the last words he said to me were, "Make sure that my state is good." I was doing a video promoting something. "Make sure your state is good, because we have to give people the illusion of hope."
Well, at Bridgewater, you have to give them the illusion that they could one day become Ray themselves. A big part
Right.
of the Bridgewater story, not the story that I tell, by the way, but literally the entire history of the firm, is people constantly coming in and thinking that they too could be the next Ray Dalio. They could get what he has. No one ever does. Spoiler alert. But
Right.
constantly going, you have to give someone the illusion that they might be the next chosen person.
One of the things, and this is something that I'm super sensitive to since leaving, is language and like terminologies. And I was reading in there where he was calling people pieces of equipment, right? And it feels like, and the model that he creates there has somewhat of a dystopian state, right? Like it has this kind of like, you're performing, we're monitoring your performance, people are all bought in. They don't necessarily know that. And it's done with the principles, but none of the things that they're doing embody the principles. The transparency is really enslaving them more than it is freeing them. And I'm wondering what you think inspires that, because this guy could have pieced out years ago, and if he really wanted to do altruistic things, there's ways to do altruistic things and have no one really know about it. And he thinks he's kind of likened himself to a philosopher now. He's gone from hedge fund manager to marketing himself as a philosopher. What do you think's driving that? What can you say in your experience do you notice, and like what's it about for him, do you think?
So that to me is sort of the most fascinating question of all, because when I started writing the book, and I started writing it really full time in 2020, I didn't realize something very important, which is that Ray was already a billionaire by around 2005, before the words principles ever come out of his mouth. So he's already made more money than he ever could have dreamed of. He's become one of the world's largest hedge fund managers, and he's in his 50s at that point. And then he starts to search for sort of like an overarching life's meaning, that it doesn't have to do with just strictly making more money. And this is very different, by the way, from, say, generations before. Think of like the Rockefellers, the early 1900s. They did found a university. So like, I'm not saying that they didn't love seeing their names places, but, they were sort of like, there was a bit of like a braggadocio to it all. It wasn't like, I'm here to help you. Ray and, this sort of Elon Musk, even like a Steve Jobs type figure, they seem to have this idea that like, just because they're really good at something in business, that they've also cracked something to do with the human condition. And more than that, they say that they must have cracked something to do with the human condition if they are this successful in business. I think that Ray always enjoyed being sort of like a terror at Bridgewater, and always enjoyed pretending that he was helping people. But it was so much more satisfying to be able to do that on Charlie Rose, on CBS This Morning, on interviews with Gwyneth Paltrow, on going to these conferences and, seeing hundreds of people line up to sign his book. Genuinely sought that celebrity. And if he ever admitted that the principles had nothing to do with his success, which by the way, they didn't, because he was already wildly successful before he ever made them up, it's like he wouldn't have that fame. He would just be another rich guy. I would be very interested. I would love to see you guys interview like a Walter Isaacson, who wrote this book about Elon Musk, because Walter and I have a lot of respect for him. We have very different views on what makes sort of a successful business person. Walter's view in that book is that sort of Elon has to be tortured. All of the horrible things that happened to Elon in his youth and the terrible way he treated his wives and his children, that was all necessary in order for him to really start a rocket company, popularize the electric car, that was all necessary. I reject that view. I think that it is possible to have both. I think what it is when you become super wealthy, you now have this great justification to act in a way that almost none of us could act. And I think that it's fun for Ray. I think he genuinely enjoys it, and he sees, because he's so wealthy, he has almost no consequences to his actions.
And nobody's saying no.
There's no one in his life to say no, because his whole life revolves around Bridgewater. And I write about a lot of these hyper successful people. They're not all like this, by the way. I'm not like someone who just like knee jerk hates people for being
right.
for being wealthy. But when you have, and I would say it starts at about $500 million, doesn't even start at $1 billion. You have virtually no interaction with anyone in your day-to-day life who isn't working for you in some way. Your spouse relies on you for their income. Your kids obviously rely on you. They're like your personal trainer, your chef. It's like even your friends from high school or college are really enjoying going to a private island with you on vacation. By the way, I see it with them with me. I'm a reporter, so I'm not their friend, and I don't ever pretend to be. But I'll go out to dinner sometimes with these people, and they will order for me. And I'll say, hold on. You don't even know what I like. You don't know what my dietary restrictions are. I'm like, are you just accustomed to everyone just sitting at the table with you and eating what you want to eat for dinner?
Yeah.
And by the way, usually they're pretty polite about it, but it happens all the time. More than half the time they order for me.
So it kind of feels like he's made all this money, and with all that money comes, power that you probably can't anticipate with it. If you've always been driven to make the money and you've achieved it, a natural pivot might be to pull the levers you now have access to. I mean, I don't know. I'm obviously not in that tax bracket, but it seems to me like either you go off into the sunset and you do altruistic things with your money, or you have that hole to fill, right? It's like, I remember reading this quote I don't remember who it was, but one person had like, I don't know, $1 billion. Another person had $250 million. And he was kind of talking down to the $250 million person. And the $250 million person said, I have something you'll never have. And he said, what? He's like, enough. And so for me, it kind of feels like there's just not enough. And Ray is inventing this persona, based on a lot of things that, his admiration of Steve Jobs, that he wants. I can only assess like a legacy to look back on. He wants a university, and he wants Dalio halls all over the place. I don't know. It's very hard to figure out, but he's really willing to invent this persona based on principles and then just abuse the principles in order to maintain it. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes out, because he seems to be pretty effective. I mean, I had a peripheral relationship with his work, but only because it had gotten so far, because he had put so much time and energy into the marketing of himself.
And what's great too is he'll claim that actually he spends almost no time marketing himself, that this is just a sort of gift he wants to give the world, and that it's just obviously people would love to hear from him because it's really worked for him, so he hopes it works for you. The legacy aspect, he surely wants Bridgewater, the hedge fund, to succeed because he gets paid money for it. But in a way, I almost wonder, and a lot of people around Bridgewater wonder, if he actually does want it to outlast him, because Steve Jobs' Apple is even more successful now than it was when he was around. But the really wonderful thing for Ray would be if Bridgewater failed. And it is failing. It's way smaller than it was when I even wrote the book. Because then Ray could say, well, you really needed me all along. You didn't follow the principles.
He would love that.
He would love that. He has plenty of money, obviously, so it wouldn't affect him too much. And then he could continue to, flog a new principle every day. There's something that happens in the book I'm going to spoil briefly, which is that at a very difficult moment for Ray, he makes up a new principle that basically turns the principles on their head. And to me, that was a shocking moment. But I'm going to give you sort of a behind the scenes peek here, which is that I was actually covering that story for the Wall Street Journal. We were like the only ones who had any clue what was going on. And the person who told me about that new principle was Ray Dalio in an interview with me. So it's like, you've so lost the perspective on even your own work and your own pseudo philosophy that you don't even see that this new principle that you've just invented is completely antithetical to the last 3 years of conversations that we've had.
And which principle was that?
That was that only a fraction of the people at Bridgewater can receive true radical transparency. Only give it to people you can trust. So he's essentially saying now, no longer at Bridgewater will everything be visible to everyone. It's straight out of, Animal Farm, where they say all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And I just thought, like, wow, Ray, you've flipped it for your own, but he doesn't see it that way, because he sees, if I've come up with a new principle, then it must be just.
And there's nobody saying that's not okay.
Well, there's 1,500 people who
he's created it this
yeah,
way.
Exactly. They could all say it's not okay, but he would win the argument because of the baseball cards, because of the dot collector. And that to me was just like a breathtaking. If I had made it up, you wouldn't believe it. So yeah, I still think about that, frankly.
For more background on what brought us here, check out my page-turning memoir. It's called Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life. It's available on Amazon, Audible, and at most bookstores. And if you want to see that story in streaming form, you can watch both seasons of The Vow on HBO.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
You've heard from our sponsors. Now let's get back to a little bit culty, shall we?
When did you figure out, like, in your reporting that this was cult-like? When did you start making those parallels for yourself?
So people have often, like, there are little bits and pieces out there where people say, this sounds like a cult, etc. But I almost, and I hate to say it on this podcast, that the word cult has become so watered down at this point. It's like Soul Cycle is
true.
a cult.
Yeah.
It's like, no, it's not. You just really like spinning. Maybe there are aspects of community.
We would say it's culty. There's elements that are culty, but it's not a cult.
Exactly. Like
there's tactics.
Exactly. So
tactics,
that's how I always thought.
Yeah.
And then, it really happened when I became involved in the story, which is that I'd interviewed Ray and other people at the firm, and two major things happened. One, I interviewed him at one point for a Wall Street Journal story. I was in there, and he posted this very long LinkedIn rant about me afterwards that was just fiction. He quoted me saying things I didn't say. It isn't what happened. And I had the whole thing recorded. And I said, okay, he's inventing his own reality. And lots of people at Bridgewater know this is not true, and no one is standing up for me. And the second thing that happened was I wrote a very sort of unimportant in the long run story about a woman at Bridgewater who asked to be paid equal to the men. And I had been texting with her about it just for comment. It's my job to always reach out to people. And we had a perfectly pleasant text message exchange. And then Ray posted those messages publicly, put out a press release about me, and he edited them. But it looked like a real text. It looked like iOS, but it was like photoshopped. And I just thought, okay, this is like someone who is now fully past the Rubicon. Now we're making things up. This woman, is allowing him to, because she knows it's not true, because it's not the messages that we had. And I was like, this has never happened to me before in 15 years of covering finance. This guy is creating his own reality. And to me, at least, I think that that's like a core part of a cult, is when it crosses, it's like through the looking glass. Something actually happens in real life, and the leader decides that can't be what happened, and convinces everyone to just say something else happened.
A lot of what I see coming down from his behaviors, and this is something we got from someone we interviewed literally in our first, I think, 2 to 3 weeks of starting our podcast, a guy named Daniel Shaw, and he describes the narcissistic personality disorder. And it's like they feel entitled to anything they want. And that was one of the things that really struck me about Ray Dalio is there's certain people that want to say certain things, feel they should be able to say certain things. And this guy's willing to come up with a system where he feels like it's okay to go up to say exactly what you're thinking to people. And then he's manipulated them to thinking it's for their own good so he can scratch that itch.
Correct. And what I would add to it, and I should say I'm not a doctor, I can't diagnose him, etc. But a core part of narcissism too is that you truly cannot recognize the other person's feelings.
Yeah.
It's not only that you're
Right.
choosing to ignore it, it's that you just don't see it.
And calling them, what was it?
Machines.
Pieces of equipment certainly helps you from developing that sensitivity.
And he's unashamed about that, by the way. He doesn't see that there's anything wrong with that. When he says to people, this happens twice in the book, when someone, whatever, is arguing with him, and he says, well, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? It's like, well, now you're not even engaging with the argument. You're just being cruel.
Niall Ferguson, where's your model? Where's your fucking model?
Yeah, that's a great scene. I love that.
It's nuts. It's nuts.
I have to bring up a story that Keith told us once because I think you'll like the parallels. He taught us this model of what he called the suppressive, also stolen from Scientology. And we did a lot of sort of like thought experiments to understand. And he said this thing to try to understand. He didn't call us sociopath, but sociopath, suppressive is kind of the same thing. Somebody who's willing to lie, steal, cheat, and do whatever it takes to win, which if you have a morality, you'd never even consider that these people are operating out there because you can't project into that type of mentality. Like this is something we learned in NXIVM to understand how the world works, not ever thinking that maybe that was also him teaching us, right? But to understand this type of psychology, he gave us an example of, and I'll just walk you through it. So like, Rob, imagine that you're in jail, in prison for something that you didn't do. And there were guards outside the door. And to get out, you'd have to like kill one of the guards. And you would imagine, it's like, Rob, how does that feel? Like, could you kill somebody to free yourself? I don't know what you'd say, but like for me, I'm like, oh, I've never killed anybody. Now imagine, Rob, that the guard is just a robot that you have to like dismantle their wiring. Does that feel better? And yeah, you'd be like, sure, I just dismantle the robot, like rip their head off and get out. So Keith said that's what it's like for a sociopath. The people in their way of getting what they want are just robots to dismantle. They're not people that you might hurt. And I thought of that a lot when I was reading your book, is just that psychology of people who are like basically robots who are performing or not performing as per his dotting and baseball cards and wanting to even make how much spent tens of millions of dollars trying to make a software that would basically be his brain, right? That never went anywhere, correct?
By the way, I have a question for you on that,
Yeah.
which is that, do you think that Keith knew that he was describing himself to you and was sort of curious if you would recognize it?
I mean, I didn't know that at the time, obviously, but now.
He knew that and tried to hide it.
Yeah. We've also since learned that sociopaths love to operate in plain sight and teach you about what they're doing whilst doing it. And he taught us a lot of different strategies as well that we now know were him.
I'm not sure Ray's there.
No, I don't know.
I don't
about,
know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It seems like more like he's enjoying, it's just fun. It'd be like a game or maybe an experiment.
He is. And I would say if you gave him that same analogy and you said, like, do you recognize any of this? He would say no, that actually I've studied people and that I have these hundreds of attributes of humans and that like I do see them as different. But he would say that like he is different. He operates on another level, that he can recognize all of these qualities. Like in a way, he wouldn't want to call himself a sociopath because it would be like almost common that he was just like another person who was like this. Although I would say there's a lot of aspects and a lot of things that happen in this book and at Bridgewater writ large that require you to ignore the other person's feelings, to treat them as a robot. It's wild. That's a spooky story.
I know it is spooky because that also leads to like the other parallel that I saw throughout in terms of his behavior and how he like publicly humiliated, berated, verbally abusive to people. To me, he reminded me a lot of Werner Erhard. And I just wondered if you had made the landmark connection or the Werner connection in your investigation.
So I hadn't, and this actually connects to something that we talked about earlier, which is that, so Ray's worth $20 billion. He hired 3 different law firms, very expensive law firms, to threaten me. And I'm super grateful, by the way. My publisher was amazing. My lawyers were amazing. The only thing they told me was you cannot make a strong connection, or really any connection, between Ray and another person. Like you can't bring the reader there. So I want the reader to make those connections, but I can't actually compare him to other, we call them personality-based organizations. I get asked a fair amount, is Bridgewater a cult? Although I think we'd probably all agree that like the word like is probably culty. What I always say is Bridgewater is a closed organization that operates with a charismatic leader according to a strict dogma with harsh punishments to those who fall out of line. Does that make it a cult? I'd had to have someone else answer that question, but it's like we're in an interesting place where it's like you can describe someone as a cult. You can say, oh, there's all these similarities between these organizations, but the only thing I'm not permitted to do is sort of like take you across that bridge. I can walk you to that bridge, but you've got to walk across it yourself.
Well, I will walk across that bridge with you.
It's a good segue to kind of what our podcast is about, because one of the things that I say in almost every episode, if not every other episode, is the abuses of power that go on in cults aren't proprietary to cults. They go on everywhere. So if you're not in a cult, there's certain things that cults do to abuse power to give them kind of the same feel of a cult. So all that being said, what do you think Ray's special brand of abuse of power are? How do you think he does it if you were to quantify it?
Oh, that's an easy one for me. Ray tells you he's doing it to help you. I am so conscious of people who say that they're helping you while they're hurting you.
That's a red flag.
Maybe I'm naive, by the way, or tell me that I need more life experience. I respect that. But I believe that you very rarely, if ever, need to harm someone to help them. I would also say, and this happens in a lot of workplaces, by the way, even ones that are not even a little bit culty. There you go. When you give away your own values, when you say, no, we here at Netflix, this is a real thing, that Netflix has its own dogma, that it has its own PowerPoint, that they say you should act this way. Really question whether you are giving up the values that your family or your religion or your friends gave you for an organization. Because ultimately, Netflix's goal is to sell subscriptions to Netflix. Tesla's goal is to sell. Bridgewater's goal, in theory, is to invest your money to make more money. I get so freaked out by almost every company now has these like philosophies or 10 rules to live by. Again, I think we all know those. We know what is right and what is wrong generally.
Yep. One other caveat I'd add to that, and tell me what you think. If I've earned my reputation or I've earned my credibility in one field, and then I want to take that credibility, that earned authority in one field, and just skip to the authority of another field. So, you have hedge fund, and now because he's earned that, I think he feels like, oh, I can just be a philosopher now and not have to go through the trials and tribulations of earning what it takes to be in a position to philosophize. But it's like he's using the power he's earned in one field and saying, oh, I should be at the same status in another, and you should listen to me, and I should have an earned authority as a philosopher and tell you how to live your life just because I've been good at, just because I've made a lot of money.
Absolutely.
Seems to be a playbook of a lot of people, presidents included.
Well, the Trump comparison is an interesting one, and it comes up a little bit in the book, though I do try to avoid it just because I feel like everyone's exhausted of Trump.
So tired of it.
No, but it is true, this idea that we would elect you president because even if you were a successful real estate developer, the thing that links all these people, and the Steve Jobs, et cetera, is they're just really good at making money. And he was really good at making a phone, which changed all of our lives. But almost none of them ever credit it to luck, circumstance, or to the number two person that they hired who actually did a lot of the work, or
the family they married into.
Exactly, family they married into. I just wish a lot more of these people said, I made $20 billion. I'm the most fortunate person on earth, and I can't tell you how to do that because I don't even know how I did it.
Right.
We just did 2 episodes on Landmark. I do have verified proof from ex-Landmark grads because people have been coming to us and they've been saying, Did you know that Ray Dalio did Landmark through Vantos, which is like the VIP section?
I did not know that.
Yes, that's what I get to tell you something new about Ray Dalio. So yeah.
You're a little bit of a sleuth
I'm
over
a
here,
sleuth.
aren't you?
Yeah. So like the things that were similar, just so you know, were specifically like the public. I've got some notes here from my spy. Drilling people in meetings, so radical transparency, the principles, going back in the past to find the source of the error. Like that's all classic Landmark, which I knew already before reading your book because we just prepped for Landmark, which by the way, Landmark, Scientology, Nexium, it's all like, it's hard to know now what came first, but it's all overlaps of the same principles. An actual principles, not like Ray Dalio's principles.
That's wild. I would love to learn more about that offline.
Yes.
You know what's so great about that too?
Part 2.
Exactly, part 2. You guys get a second season. I just get a paperback.
Yeah.
What I love about it too is that because Ray always loves to claim that he came up with it all, that this came from out of his study of history and that he started to come up with these rules. He would hate to credit that he took other classes or that.
Well, that's why I was so curious, is that because like Vantos apparently is like the private. There's so many different things in what we call now the wacky world of Werner Erhard. There's Werner, there's Landmark, there's the Forum. Now I know about Vantos, which basically was the group where it was for private premium corporate clients. So Bridgewater was a client of Vantos, apparently, according to my Landmark insider.
That's fantastic. And you're absolutely right. One of his favorite things is root cause, is finding the root cause of something. And it always winds up being something.
Same.
There you go. I mean, it's always something about you.
Right. Well, that's the gaslighting. The inherent thing in all of these people, whether it's Ray, Landmark, Scientology, the gaslighting is built into the structure of like trying to figure out what caused this in the best way possible for the growth of everybody. Sounds really positive. It's not. It is not. Because it also deflects responsibility from the leader, which is like the thing that I thought was so crazy about your book is that all these things that happened, none of it's his fault. Can never be his fault.
Never, not once.
Well, he takes credit too.
No.
It's his fault for hiring you. It's one of the great flips ever. If he was like, this is my fault. I gave you too much responsibility.
Sidebar, just to relate it for our audience. This is, I don't know if you're following the Dan Schneider case with the Nickelodeon in Hollywood expose, right? So he did a public apology, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone. Like that was a different era. I would never do that now, blah, blah, super, super apologetic. And at the end, he asked like, what would you do differently? He said, well, I'd have a therapist on set. I said, great. That would have been amazing to have somebody for the kids to talk to. No. The therapist would have been there to ask the kids when they signed up, do they really want to do this? Do they understand how hard it's going to be? And I was like, you can go fuck yourself. Like you are disgusting.
Do you understand that you're going to be molested? Is that what the therapist was supposed to say?
Yeah. Like, exactly. Yeah. That you may or may not be. Do you understand that this may be part of the job? Fuck off. Sorry. I get a little riled up.
It's unchecked power too.
Yeah. But the thing with Landmark brought up this, ongoing conversation we've been having, like, when is leadership good? When is it bad? And when do these methods become exploitative? And when does it go from growth to coercion? It's like the ongoing debate in this particular arena. So I just loved your book. I did read it I listened to it on Audible at 2 times the speed for efficiency speed. So for me, it read like a thriller. It's like, and then he did this, and then he did that, and then blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, my heart is racing the whole time because of the speed.
What I actually love about the book is I left out a lot of stuff about the book because I'm trying to make it a thriller. I'm trying to make it like this dark thing where it's surprising and you think you know where it's going to go and you think that someone's going to be a hero. Maybe they try or maybe they don't try. It's like it's stranger than fiction for me. And it's not easy. It's a book that takes place over 50 years. And remember, these are real people. They're all real people to try to get, that past the lawyers. And what's remarkable is I love the book. It's crazy. It's wild. After the book came out, just a few months ago, not a single complaint, not a single lawyer letter, no lawsuit. It's like, oh, I could have gone even harder.
Right.
Well, the truth too, like you have to have, this is the radical transparency that the book is bringing forward and they don't like it. So
yeah, it
would make sense that they don't do that. Also, it draws attention to your book.
They don't want to, they don't want to give you your...
That's fair. That's true. But it did well. And it's my favorite feedback that I get from people occasionally is they'll be like, I didn't really learn anything about finance. And I'm like, oh no, yeah, this isn't supposed to be in the how-to section. Maybe how to escape from a personality-based organization.
Yeah, I learned about finance.
Oh, good.
I felt like because I've never understood hedge funds or that world at all. So I feel like I have a better understanding and I will not go there. I did learn about that. It just fortified a lot of my beliefs around these types of personalities. Is there anything we didn't ask you that you feel like is important or that you want our listeners to know or that we didn't cover?
No, this was honestly wonderful. I feel like we got a good taste of everything. I would correct you on one thing I think you said early on, which is something like no one gets physically hurt or something. There is some physical coercion.
Oh, yeah. Okay, tell me.
And it is gender based. There's one character in particular who she's very low ranking and she becomes involved with the CEO. And I won't spoil what happens, but to me, there are a lot of examples of this at Bridgewater, but I chose just to have one because I wanted to show the reader what happens when sort of a younger woman gets involved and tries to speak the truth about what is happening between her and the CEO. And remember, they have different baseball cards, so she's much less credible. So this is how, when you apply sort of like vanilla sexual misconduct and you try to put it inside this radical transparency, what happens? To me, I found that very disturbing just as I was writing it, because it was like there's so many moments there where you say, just go to the police or just, tell your spouse or tell someone outside of Bridgewater. But when you're in an organization that forces you to adjudicate these disputes inside based on their quote unquote system, imagine what happens.
Yes. And I feel like it's important to say to our listeners that we barely scratched the surface of some of the, horrendous things that you outlined, even now knowing that you didn't even keep the worst part for obvious reasons. But it's a gripping book. It is an important book. It's definitely more than a little bit culty, in my opinion.
The people that were compliant when the abuse was going on, if people become more brave since the book's come out and reached out to you and told a story, or?
Yes, some people have. I get more inbound than I ever did. Some people say I didn't even, scratch the surface. Almost no one has come in and said, like, some people will say, oh, you got this part, exaggerated or whatever. That's their perspective. That's okay. But what's wild to me is that he's still out there. He's still recruiting. He's still on college campuses. He's still on TV networks. And he's so sensitive. People do ask him about my book and he just seems angry about it. It's like, you can't believe that someone actually did the work of following up on these stories. So, but no, it's been wonderful. And as a journalist, I will just say, like, my goal is not to take down Bridgewater. It's not to take down. I'm not the FBI.
No.
It's just to tell like this wild story that I think we can all relate to.
Well, I will say there was a group of people that attempted to take Keith down before us, and it was a very necessary punch for us to get out as well. So, maybe this is the first one of many to come out. So I appreciate your work. It opened up my eyes, particularly when people come to you with all the answers. And so the book was really great, and it's a great read. And I'm going to recommend it to everyone that gave me principles. I have a book for you now.
Where can people find you? Where can people buy the book? All that fun stuff.
Book is everywhere. It's on Audible. It's on Kindle. It's in your bookstore. You can find me on Twitter at Real Rob Copeland. I'm not a big tweeter. I'm on LinkedIn and I write for the New York Times, so you can keep, reading my work.
And what's next? Do you know yet?
God, I would love another like wonderful character. I will definitely write another book. My publisher would love for me to write another book. I'm just looking for something I can really dig into. And I will say, this is not me. There's someone writing a book on the female orgasm cult.
Oh, One Taste?
One Taste. Yeah. I can't wait for that book.
Mm.
I just to me, that's very different. So honestly, the next thing is I'm encouraging her to finish that book because I can't wait to buy it.
Great.
Is your book being made into a series or a movie?
It's been optioned. I'm not sure if they're going to make it, so we're definitely still open to more people. These things take a long time, but we have a lot of interest.
Yeah. Make sure Ray didn't option it.
Yeah, make sure Ray didn't option it and shelve it.
Listen, I'm in my 1-bedroom apartment now, so there is a price at which he can option it. But no, I hope that they make it.
If Ray offered you $1 million to burn all the books,
much more. There is. Someone did ask me once if there was.
He's got more.
Yeah, if there was a price, I was like, "Oh, there's a price. It's just like we're nowhere near it."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that you get that amount in residuals from your book. And thank you for your time and your efforts in this incredible
this is great.
Story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fun dive.
Really fun. You like what you hear? Please do give us a rating, a review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. Every little bit helps us get this cult awareness content out there. Smash that subscribe button. You know what to do. Thanks, everybody. That was our chat with Rob Copeland. Please do get his book, The Fund, anywhere books are sold, and we'll also have a link in our show notes. We'll be talking about this episode over on Patreon at patreon.com/littlebitculty. So be sure to join us over there and keep the conversation going and perhaps even get a new silver and black fanny pack.
Please get this book. It reads like a thriller. It's very informative, and I think it is a great parallel between what I think is going on in all other aspects that billionaires have their fingers in.
And if you've been in a cult or even just are interested in any of the stories we covered here in A Little Bit Culty, I think you'll be blown away by the parallels of the world that Ray Dalio allegedly created and the world that cult leaders create, especially NXIVM. Mind-blowingly similar. So enjoy. Let us know what you think of the book. And until next time, don't sell your soul to a mediocre hedge fund pseudo-philosopher king.
Or any hedge fund, for that matter.
We'll be back soon with all new episodes of A Little Bit Culty.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We're heading over to patreon.com/alittlebitculty now to discuss this episode. In the meantime, dear listener, please remember, this podcast is solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. It's not intended as a substitute for real medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. For cult recovery resources and to learn more about seeking safely in this culty world, check out alittlebitculty.com/culty resources and don't miss Sarah's TED Talk called How Cult Literate Are You? Great stuff.
A Little Bit Culty is a Trace 120 production, executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, in collaboration with producer Will Rutherford at Citizens of Sound and our co-creator and show chaplain / bodyguard, Jess Temple Tardy. And our theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant.